Hello, today I'm going to be answering the question, what is the best cooling configuration for Lian's brand new O11 Air Mini? Now, I've already done a full step-by-step build guide as well as a full case review for this case, and if you haven't seen either of those videos, you'll find links to them in the description. So before we get into the temperatures, I wanted to give you a look at the build I put together in the case. So for parts, we had Intel's i5 11500 being cooled by Cooler Master's ML240 Illusion 240mm AIO. So I had that radiator on the side of the case set to exhaust, and rather than using the included case fans, I used Lian's Unifans SL120s on the radiator. For the graphics card, I used the ROG STRIX 3080, and I maxed out all of the case fan locations, so that was two 140mm fans both at the front and at the bottom set to intake, and for exhaust fans we had three 120mm fans at the top and one at the rear. All of the case fans used in the build were Lian Unifans, either SL120 or SL140 fans. It's also important to say that all of the fans in the build were controlled using the standard fan curves in the motherboard BIOS, and that ambient temperature was controlled to 20 degrees during all thermal testing. So taking a look at the temperatures, our CPU idled at 31 degrees and reached a maximum of 91 degrees during the 10-minute ARESGAME stability test. Our GPU idled at 30 degrees, reaching a maximum of 70 degrees during the 10-minute ARESGAME stability test. The average noise levels recorded 30 centimeters away from the closed tempered glass side panel were 33 decibels at idle and 44 decibels under load. So very impressive numbers in terms of temperatures and noise. Now when I'm putting a build together, I always go with what I think is the best thermal configuration. Importantly, I don't just go with the temperatures, I will try and factor in the noise and importantly the aesthetics. And for me, looking at the case, this is what I thought would give the best overall configuration. Now I know some of you right from the start will be questioning my choice of having the radiator set to exhaust, because everybody knows having your radiator set to intake where it gets cooler from outside the case is going to give you better CPU temperatures than a radiator set to exhaust where it's getting the air from inside the case. The downside to having your radiator set to an intake is that the hot air ends up in the case, heating up your GPU and all the other components. What I have found in the past, in these cases where you have a side as an option for either intake or exhaust, if you have your front fan set to intake, they bring in a source of cool air, and if it goes straight through the radiator, your radiator almost sees as much cool air as it does being on the front of the case. The advantage of having your radiator on the side is that all that hot air goes straight out of the case rather than coming in and heating up all your other components. As well, aesthetically that looks great because your fans set to exhaust means the fans on the side are facing the right way round. So what I found in the past is that this not only gives you the best overall temperatures but also looks great as well. So now what I want to do is change some of the configurations about and see what effect that has on the temperatures. So the first thing I wanted to test was the effect of removing the two fans at the bottom below the GPU and seeing what difference that makes. So removing the two fans below the GPU, our CPU idled 1 degree cooler while there was no difference to the CPU temperatures under load. In terms of GPU temperatures, with no fans at the bottom, our GPU was 1 degree cooler at idle while it was 2 degrees hotter under load. In terms of noise levels, as these Lian Unifans are incredibly quiet, removing two of the fans from the build didn't make any difference to the idle noise levels. However, under load, the build without the two fans at the bottom was actually louder by 3 decibels, and the only reason I can think for that is that because the GPU was running slightly hotter, the fans were spinning up much more, and the GPU fans were significantly louder than the Lian case fans. So certainly having the two fans below your GPU is going to bring your temperatures under load down by a little bit, but not as much as I would have expected. And I think that's largely due to the amount of airflow that must be coming in from the front of the case, so the GPU is getting plenty of air regardless of whether or not you have fans down at the bottom. So whether you should go for fans at the bottom or not is really going to depend on whether the extra cost of the fans is worth it or not for you in terms of the temperature saving, and also aesthetically, whether you like the look of the fans at the bottom or not. The next thing I wanted to test was the effect of adding an extra set of fans onto the radiator and running it in a push-pull configuration. So running the radiator in a push-pull configuration, our CPU was 1 degree cooler at idle, but 1 degree hotter under load. In terms of GPU temperatures, there was no difference at idle, but the push-pull configuration brought GPU temperatures up by 2 degrees under load. In terms of noise levels, there was no difference at idle, but the push-pull configuration was 5 decibels louder under load. So with the push-pull configuration, we had worse temperatures, a significantly louder build, and we were going to have to pay extra money for 2 additional fans, so I would stay away from a push-pull configuration. The next thing I want to look at will be getting an additional advantage by turning the fans around on the radiator and having them set to intake rather than exhaust. Taking a look at our temperatures, there was no difference to the temperatures at idle. Under load, our CPU ran 1 degree cooler with the radiator set to intake, while our GPU temperatures were 2 degrees worse. And again, that makes perfect sense. The CPU temperatures are going to be cooler because we're getting cooler from outside the case, but that hot air goes inside the case and heats up our other components, in this situation, our GPU. In terms of noise levels, the only difference was noticed at idle, where the radiator set to intake was 1 decibel quieter. So overall, with the radiator set to intake on the side, although our CPU temperatures came down slightly, our GPU temperatures increased more, so overall the temperatures were worse. But the biggest thing for me was actually the aesthetics, because having the fans on the side set to intake meant you were looking at the back of the fans. Having them set to exhaust, you were looking at the good side of the fans, the front of the fans. So for me, it's simple. Keep your fans on the radiator on the side set to exhaust. The next thing I wanted to look at was the effects of moving the radiator to the top. So I added 2 120mm fans on the side set to intake. Taking a look at the temperatures, with our radiator at the top, our CPU idled 2 degrees hotter, while under the ARESGAME stability test it was 4 degrees hotter. In terms of GPU temperatures, with the top mounted radiator, our GPU idled 1 degree hotter, while it was 2 degrees cooler under load. The top mounted radiator was also louder by 1 decibel at idle and 2 decibels under load. So these results are absolutely no surprise at all. Having your radiator at the top, the air going through it is going to be hot air from the case that the GPU has heated up. So the cooling potential is going to be much less than if we had the cool air from outside the case. The other important thing to factor in is the aesthetics. At the top of the case, we can't fit a 360mm radiator, although we can fit 3 120mm fans. So having the 240mm radiator at the top just didn't look as good. It didn't fill the top of the case as well as the 3 fans did, and it looked much better to me on the side. So I would stay away from a top mounted radiator in this case. The next thing I wanted to test was moving the radiator to the front, having it set to intake. The most sensible configuration for the side to me seemed to have the 2 fans set to exhaust, so the hot air coming through the radiator would go straight out the back of the case, while the GPU would still be able to get fresh air from the fans underneath it. So with the front mounted radiator, our CPU idled 2 degrees cooler, while under the ARESGAME stability test it was 5 degrees cooler. With the front mounted radiator, our GPU idled 1 degree cooler, while it was 2 degrees hotter under load, and there was no difference to the noise levels. So overall, in terms of temperatures, under load our GPU temperatures came up by a little bit, but our CPU temperatures came down by a massive amount, and this was much more than I was expecting with the CPU temperatures. Because like I've said, in other cases where I've set them up in a similar way, with the radiator on the side set to exhaust and front intake fans, I've had similar results with the side radiator as what I have when I've moved it to the front. The only way I can explain this bigger than expected reduction in CPU temperatures by moving the radiator from the side to the front is actually related to the position of the front fans to the side radiator. And in this particular case, the fans are set very far back into the case and actually overlap the radiator. In other cases I've tested this in, the fans are actually outside the main body of the case, so they're well in front of the radiator. And this would mean that any air coming through the fans would have more of a chance of going through the radiator. In this particular case, because the fans sit so far down the radiator, it's quite a steep angle for the air to turn and go through the radiator. The next thing I wanted to test was leaving the front radiator set to intake, but flipping the fans round on the side and having them set to intake rather than exhaust. Taking a look at the temperatures, and the only difference was with the side intake fans, our CPU ran 2 degrees hotter under load. In terms of noise levels, with the side fans set to intake, our build was 1 decibel quieter at idle, while there was no difference under load. So again, here the results are fairly clear. With a front mounted radiator, you're going to want to have your fans on the side set to exhaust, because not only will your CPU run cooler, but your build is going to look much better as the fans are the correct way round. The final thing I wanted to test with a front mounted radiator was actually removing the side fans and putting the side brackets back in place. Taking a look at the temperatures, our CPU temperature under load was in between the two previous configurations, while this particular configuration had the loudest idle noise levels. So on a first look at these results, you might think actually I'm only bringing my CPU temperatures under load down by 1 degree by having side exhaust fans, and that to me is not worth the price of 2 fans. What is worth the price of 2 fans to me is the aesthetics. Having the fans on the side set to exhaust looks great. I think leaving this empty does not look good at all. So for me, I definitely would recommend with a front mounted radiator having 2 side exhaust fans. The final thing I wanted to test was how good this case was for air cooling. Now normally when I'm trying to test a case's air cooling potential, I will use Nokia's NHD15. And with a maximum CPU cooler height of 170 centimeters, the NHD15 should fit in this case. Now importantly, that 170 centimeters is exactly the same height as you got in the original O11 Dynamic Mini. And I struggled to fit the NHD15 in that case. I was able to get the heatsink fitted without any problem, but I couldn't fit the fan on front of the front heatsink, and actually I had to move it further back, and then the glass panel was pushing right up against the fan, so this wouldn't be a configuration I would recommend. So instead in this case I went ahead with Cooler Master's Master Air MA612 Stealth ARGB cooler. I put 2 120mm fans on the side set to intake, and I compared this to our best cooling configuration with the AIO so far, which was the front radiator with the side exhaust. So taking a look at the temperatures, there was no difference to our CPU temperatures at idle, while under the IDA64 stability test, our CPU ran 13 degrees hotter with the air cooler. It is also important to say that this was the only configuration where thermal throttling of our CPU was noted, and this was up to 6% at times. Taking a look at our GPU temperatures were down by 1 degree with the air cooler, both at idle and under load. In terms of noise levels, there was no significant difference, with our air cooler being 1 decibel quieter at idle, but 1 decibel louder under load. So that's an absolutely massive difference in terms of CPU temperatures by using an AIO compared to an air cooler. So my recommendation for building this case would most definitely be to use an AIO. What I'm going to do now is put a thermal testing summary slide up, so if you want to have a detailed look at all the different configurations I've tested, go ahead and pause your video now. So putting all that together, my current recommendations for building in this case would be to go with a front mounted radiator set to intake and have side exhaust fans, because overall that gave us the best thermal configurations but also very acceptable aesthetics as well. The other advantage of this is at the front you can actually fit up to a 280mm radiator, whereas at the side you're limited to a 240mm radiator, so you should actually even be able to get better thermal testing results than what I've demonstrated in this video. So hopefully you found the video useful. If you have, please remember to check out my full case review and also my step-by-step build guide in this case. And as well, if you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.